And it's back to the problems of the church in this latest podcast from the Erasmus Forum, or more accurately, problems of two churches. The Church of England's perennial problems with its own personnel and its failure to find a good and quick answer to the question, who's going to be the next Archbishop of Canterbury? There's been a gap in that high office now for several months. By comparison, the Roman Catholic Church has found it quite easy to find a new pope within a matter of just 2 weeks. So what's the difference between these two churches, and why do they find themselves with some rather common problems as well? To discuss these questions, I'm joined by Fergus Butler-Galley, Senior Research Fellow at the Erasmus Forum, and of course, a priest of the Church of England. Fergus, there's been a vacancy in Canterbury since the first week of January.
Indeed.
After the departure, the enforced departure of the previous incumbent of that high office. And we're still waiting now to find out what's going on. And nobody seems to have very much of a clue about what's going on.
No, there is an issue that they have just announced the members of the CNC, the Crown Nominations Commission for Canterbury.
And that is itself composed of 2 or 3 committees.
Correct. And the reason why they've announced part of the membership is they still haven't got an agreement on the Canterbury diocesan representatives, because of course the thing about the Archbishop of Canterbury is he is of course the primus inter pares of the Anglican Communion, the primate of all England. However, he is also the diocesan bishop for a chunk of eastern Kent. Not a very large diocese, not actually a very wealthy diocese either, generally not particularly functioning very well. And most of the work is in the hands of the Bishop of Dover. However, there is still, as there is with each, if you're the Bishop of Salisbury or the Bishop of London, there are representatives from the diocese. Now, clearly there has been some skullduggery going on because they've had 3 attempts at running this election for those people, and they still can't agree on who actually won it.
And some people seem to think that there should be just a Bishop of Canterbury.
Yes, there is a debate about splitting the role, and in practice the Bishop of Dover sort of does do that. And certainly under the previous Archbishop, he had very little interest at all in running the diocese, practically, though other Archbishops do. But essentially what you have is a stalemate that whilst you do have some of the committee composed, you don't have all of it, and that's before they've even met once to discuss who they might have. So it's
the people, the electorate, as it were, who are putting forward the names. Is it still 2 names or just one?
I think now they put forward one preferred name with a second backup name,
and does that name still go to the Prime Minister? And
yes,
then,
to the Palace.
and then to the Sovereign.
Yes. So it's still the case that the Prime Minister and the Sovereign get these 2 names, with the strong preference being this one. However, there are circumstances where the second name then comes into play. That happens on the diocesan level actually more often than you'd think, partly because people turn down their nominations. People retire. There are various things come to light that means they can't take it up. There have been instances where there have been such protest from the diocese that they essentially have refused to elect. It's still the case. In fact, it's still technically the case that it is the dean and chapter who elect the archbishop.
Now, the role of the state in the person of the Prime Minister of the day,
yes,
used to have a very direct influence.
Absolutely. And if you look
for lots of people, this was a kind of terrible example of the Erastianism of the Church of England. That it was at the behest of a secular personality.
Well, yes, and there was sort of great questions about what happens when there is a Roman Catholic or a Jewish or a Hindu prime minister, and there are actually constitutional things to go into place.
Harold Wilson, who was brought up a Congregationalist, like his wife, loved church affairs, intervened often.
They often do. It's interesting that Tony Blair, when he came into office, said, this is rubbish, we've got to get rid of it, in his kind of classic style of wanting to, tinker with the Constitution. And in the end, he actually ditto loved it. Mrs. Thatcher, of course, famously used it as a way of getting revenge on the Church of England, and indeed went for the second name, and it was her who put forward George Carey in the end as the kind of her revenge on the Church of England for Runcie's opposition to her, her hatred of Bishop Shepherd of Liverpool, who was an old Etonian socialist, kind of two things that she loathed, really. Certainly, Prime Minister, the infamous one, of course, is Harold Macmillan, who Geoffrey Fisher, he was living at this point, it was when Downing Street was being refurbished, had its major refurbishment during most of Macmillan. Macmillan almost never lived in Downing Street, he lived in there at the very end. He was in the Admiralty Arch, which is where the Prime Minister lived.
Which is why he used to go out into Clubland for
lunch.
Indeed,
because he could just pop in. But
Lady Dorothy not being a very domestic
not known
person.
for her great cooking skill. But Fisher went to go and visit him when he was announcing his retirement. And he said to Macmillan, there is a man he is a priest, he is a pastor, he is a great thinker, he is a great theologian, and under no circumstances should he be made the Archbishop of Canterbury. And that was the then Archbishop of York, Michael Ramsay. And Fisher said, I should know, I was his headmaster at Repton, which he was.
And had a great reputation as a thrasher.
Yes, he did.
He did.
Although, interestingly, there is some studies on that suggest that may have been made up by Roald Dahl, who hated him when he was at Repton, I think. But
I think it's pretty well known on the basis of Fisher's own diary that he really looked forward to filling in his tax return.
Oh yes,
on Boxing Day.
Yes, agreed.
That was his idea of a really good way to
he was the great
wind down after Christmas.
Manager of the church, although of course he did oversee growth, which is interesting. Fisher's a fascinating archbishop. But he says to Macmillan, I was his headmaster, so I would know. And Macmillan says, well, you might have been his headmaster, but you weren't mine, which was a slight thing that, of course, Fisher had been a successful headmaster, but he never quite ascended to be the headmaster of Eton, which was one of his sort of ambitions.
And Winston Churchill, in either 41 or 42, had a decisive say in making William Temple, great supporter of the Labour Party, of course, as Archbishop of Canterbury.
Absolutely, to
transferred him from York
to succeed Lang. And of course, Lang and Churchill did not like one another. They were on opposing sides of the abdication crisis. Yes. Lang was a great supporter of Baldwin, a great chum of Baldwin's. And Lang was known for being, in the words of Hensley Henson, the Bishop of Durham, proud, pompous and proletical. He really did.
And to which of those epithets does your Grace object?
Indeed. So he was really quite a domineering figure, and he had really a great deal of power, actually, Lang, over the Yorks, as they were, and then became the King and Queen, George VI and Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. They became really, Lang very much viewed them as his creation, having had that integral role in the abdication crisis. And of course, Churchill resented that enormously. So the retirement of Lang was a great tick in Churchill. It was a great success for Churchill. But yes, fascinating. Churchill, again, functionally an atheist, I suspect.
Yes. A kind of late Victorian pantheist.
Yes,
really.
Precisely. Yes, more of a sort of
believed that there was something out there somewhere.
Yes, but providing it didn't interfere with him, he was happy. But yes,
but famously described William Temple as the only sixpenny article in a penny bazaar.
Yes,
we're used to complaining about the quality of the leadership of the senior clergy in the Church of England these days, but perhaps we idealise the past.
Perhaps. I mean, certainly there were eccentric choices, but again, that was partly due to the political appointments which we've lost. Yes. That various prime ministers would attempt to balance the bench, both in terms of their theological views, but also their political views as well, which is how you end up, actually, of course, people forget it's deaneries as well, how you end up with Hewlett Johnson, the Red Dean of Canterbury, who becomes a great friend of Chairman Mao, who visits Russia, who's partly responsible for Stalin's...
David Lloyd George brought up a Baptist, of course, but probably a pretty functioning agnostic for most of his life. Certainly eschewed the idea of a Christian burial when the time came to plan for all of that. But he took a very involved interest in appointments to deaneries.
Yes,
he
absolutely.
Thought it is really very important part of his job.
Yeah.
And I've seen some of the correspondence.
No, they all did, and it's been. I think it has been to the detriment of both church and state. In fact, I think it's becoming increasingly clear. There is an article in the Church Times this week by Angela Tilby about this, about the fact that it's proved to be a catastrophe, because what it has allowed the church to do is to be introspective and to indulge in its partisanship. And
there was somebody called the Ecclesiastical Appointments Secretary with an office in Downing Street.
That's right.
answerable directly to the Prime Minister, and who had his fingers in every Church of England ecclesiastical pie,
Yes.
and who knew the Church of England very well, and was a layman.
Yes.
Now that person is gone.
Yes, that person was scrapped by Gordon Brown in 2008. And these are the Brown reforms. And he did it with the Regis professorships as well. You know, there were multiple things where essentially he said, I don't want to be involved in this. I've got more important things to do. And
one of those modernising things that has gone rather badly.
Yes,
wrong.
interestingly, it was, I gather, on the list, high on the list of a certain Mr. Dominic Cummings to restore this, because he felt that one of the ways that the Conservative Party had lost functional engagement with the institutions is because simply these had been replaced by quangos who had filled it with their own types of people. Of course, you never depoliticise the office, you simply change the nature in which that political appointment is made. And Cummings felt very strongly, I gather, that this was something that needed addressing if there was ever going to be proper rapprochement between the Conservative Party in particular, but actually government generally, and the universities, the church, and the other kind of ancient institutions.
So that job of the Ecclesiastical Appointment Secretary really showed something that was definitional about the Church of England, that it was, in fact, part of the life of the nation as a whole.
Absolutely.
And that it was a church rather than a sect.
Yes. And
it's a
and
national church.
Absolutely. And as you made reference to, nonconformists like Lloyd George, Wilson and Mrs. Thatcher, indeed, making these appointments. And that was because it was part of, it wasn't a confessional statement. No. It was a statement about the apparatus of of civil society, fundamentally. Yes. And therefore, and of course, it actually has a great deal of precedent in the medieval, era. And there's a kind of idea among some modern Roman Catholics that, it's always been the papacy. I mean, that's actually a very recent development. I mean, the kings of France, the presidents of France were effectively vetoing bishops in the 19th century.
Eldest daughter of the church.
Kings of Spain, the emperor, the Holy Roman Emperor, the Emperor of Austria-Hungary.
Charlemagne himself did not intervene too much in church affairs, I think. But his grandchildren did.
Absolutely. And so in some ways the Church of England is actually, or has until recently, been preserving a much more ancient dance between church and state. Really what you see in the Roman Catholic Church now is a legacy of Pius IX's kind of great tantrum in the 1870s when the unification of Italy happens and the papal states were abolished. And therefore, power is centralised into the Vatican.
So what we now have in the case of the Church of England is a kind of institutional lethargy, stasis, because we don't have a wise secular administrator who can come in and tell the clergy
cut
to
through the
behave
rubbish.
themselves.
Absolutely, and it therefore gets bogged down in the kind of very internal church things of the living in love and faith process of
lots of process.
Yes, lots of process. Wars between kind of Anglo-Catholics and evangelicals. The continuing question of the ordination of women. All these things are kind of now just playing out again as a sort of psychodrama because the church is
may be more characteristic of a sect type mentality rather than of a church.
Absolutely, and there was this idea. Some in the church welcomed the Brown reforms, saying, "Oh, this liberates us to be, the prophetic church that we want to be." Of course, that's not true at all. What it's liberated them to do is to be more introspective and less willing to engage with the world. So they have been a catastrophe, I think, and I should say it's not just Canterbury. They have failed to appoint bishops recently in Carlisle, in Ely, in Durham. There's this kind of constant...
And there's this mirage of a balanced ticket that people look for.
It just doesn't...
it's time for a woman in Canterbury.
Yes, exactly.
And we need to have parity right across the board.
And there is a problem now that the bench is very poor in terms of its political instincts, in terms of its theological training.
Very poor in terms of its intellectual
quality. And in terms of its intellectual quality. And in terms of, frankly, its sort of ability to speak, to the nation. And it's timid, it's introspective, it's self-indulgent, it's platitudinous. And actually, the part of the problem is, and this is the previous Archbishop, I should say, was very clear on controlling those levers and getting his sort of people in. The problem is that he surrounded himself with people who weren't very good. And as his resignation ended up showing, people who advised him very badly. And so therefore we have this problem that actually there aren't that many candidates who are, as the Romans would say, papabile, because they're simply either they haven't been in post long enough, or they're about to retire, or they're frankly crap. So that's the problem.
So what we now have is endless debate about who
Yes.
might be on the preferred list.
Correct. And of course, the advantage, a prime minister could simply say, well, actually, I'm going to choose, the Dean of Balliol. And that's that famous Yes Prime Minister episode where the Dean of Bailey College is made a bishop to remove the opposition to Sir Humphrey being made a fellow, and so he does this. But you no longer have the ability to cut through all this stuff. You just get this sort of molasses-like continuation of process, and the Church of England thinks
having a parliament that calls itself the Synod of the Church of England does make things worse.
Yes, it does. I think so.
Because there you have the party spirit.
Exactly.
It's fine having a party spirit when you have a secular parliament to deal with, but a synod apes the worst habits of the House of Commons.
It does, and it forces the bishops into becoming a kind of party of their own, pitches them against the clergy and against the laity, and it makes leadership. I don't envy that, but incidentally, whilst I do think the people we currently have in post are almost all useless, I think that I don't envy them because exactly this, they have been put in a position where they are sort of whipped by the Archbishop. Now, again, the previous Archbishop has a great deal of blame, I think, can be laid at his door for this. But essentially, the House of Bishops comes up with a policy, and that's and then they sort of have to sell it to the various houses, the clergy and the laity. They often fail to do this, and so they then use, administrative tinkering, backdoor kind of methods to get this stuff done. And that really isn't the way that as you say, it's aping the worst of the House of Commons, the worst instincts of government to use procedural measures to force through legislation, when actually what they should be able to do is to lead.
Now, by comparison, very evident comparison, the Roman Catholic Church found it quite easy to find a successor to Pope Francis within just 2 weeks, I think.
Yes.
And the College of Cardinals, which is the voting body, so named, I think, during the process of the medieval revival of the Church, arrived at a conclusion very, very quickly. As soon as they convened, Conclave with a key, so they weren't allowed to move out of the Sistine Chapel, and they got a result. Yes,
it was, I think, two days really of conclave itself. I think it went to the fourth vote in the end, but
they have one vote on the first day.
Yes,
and then they have up to 4 votes on the second and third days, and so on, and a requirement of a 2/3 majority.
Yes, that's right. And it was relatively quick. Although interestingly, the person who did get elected, the current Pope Leo, was not an expected front runner.
Yeah.
But what one hears from Rome is that actually the American cardinals had coalesced around. They're quite a large voting group, not as big as the Italians. The Italians still are the largest nationality. And of course, nationality doesn't necessarily matter, but there was certainly a movement in Rome that there was this idea that having had 3 non-Italian popes, actually there was time to go to an Italian pope.
For the new world.
Partly because of what needs to be addressed. There were enormous financial issues in Rome. The running of Francis was not particularly interested in the administrative running of the Vatican City State, and it was felt among a number of them, particularly the Cardinal Parolin, the Venetian Secretary of Francis, Secretary of State, who was considered a front runner.
An early front runner, and was criticised in the Italian press for allowing himself to be portrayed as a front runner.
And for making sure that he was celebrating certain things after the death of the Pope. And interestingly, there was some sort of skullduggery. There was an attempt to start the conclave as early as possible by Parolin's supporters, partly because they didn't want some of the Chinese cardinals, who of course run an underground church, coming over, because actually the cardinals of Asia are hugely critical of Parolin, because it was Parolin who negotiated the equivalent of the Concordat with the Chinese Communist Party, which has been exceptionally damaging for Chinese Christians. So Parolin,
the original Concordat with the Mussolini fascist government.
Indeed, and then with Hitler, there's a history of the Catholic Church entering into these slightly dubious arrangements,
keeping their noses clean.
With secular.
We've got to protect our people in these rather dodgy regimes, and that means that we have to cozy up to all sorts of
precisely. And the most recent one of these was with the Chinese Communist Party, negotiated by Cardinal Parolin himself as Secretary of State, and that has been something that damaged. I think probably was a fatal damage to his candidacy. And therefore, he was the nominated Italian candidate. It enabled the Americans to come in, and they chose the then Cardinal Prevost because he had been a great protege of Francis's. Francis had appointed him to run the kind of committee that decides on bishops. He was a relatively unknown factor. He had this link to the South American Church with his long ministry in Lima,
and
Peru.
a worldwide missionary status, running the Order of the Augustinians.
Exactly,
as
which
the prior of the Augustinians,
of course comes with a
which
degree
is a
of
very big administrative job.
big administrative job, and comes with a degree of intellectual heft as well.
Yes.
The Augustinians are they are one of the kind of not quite the Dominicans, but they are known for being.
Didn't Martin Luther start out as an Augustinian?
He was indeed the most
member
famous Augustinian ever was Martin Luther. And of course, the teaching of Augustine is still, as I think we've discussed in previous
the intellectual basis of modern Christianity,
essentially, and of much of the thinking of the West, really. And so I think there was probably some of that thought process going on in the minds of the cardinals, or certainly in the minds of the American Party, that kind of put him forward as their candidate. So the
idea that that the Roman Church has stolen a march by being very, very quick does really forget the fact that for long periods, medieval and Renaissance papacy, conclaves could go on for a very, very long time.
Absolutely. When conclaves work, they work. When they don't, they are actually an even worse example of stasis and politicizing. And we go back to some of the conclaves of even in the early 20th century.
Yes, they could take quite a long time.
The conclave of 1914, I think, that elects Benedict XV, goes on, and essentially they resolve it quickly because they know that the Franz Josef is sending an emissary to break to do essentially what we talked about earlier, to break the deadlock and say, I have a veto and this is my candidate.
Thereby fulfilling the role as an Austrian emperor that had once been held by the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
Absolutely, yes.
And the empire of the Carolingians before.
Indeed, yes.
So the main trend in the history of the Catholic Church from the great reforms of the 11th and 12th century has been to emphasise its autonomy, its right to run its own affairs, with occasional interference from the Holy Roman Emperor, a title that became rather popular in the 12th century with Barbarossa, thereby claiming for the secular state some of the qualities of the sacerdotum.
Absolutely, and you see, it isn't only the Holy Roman Emperor, of course, the kings of France have a long-running sort of veto on this. You have, I think it's the Papal Conclave of 1378, which sees the move to Avignon. Was it 1278, I think, the move to Avignon, because the French cardinals are essentially sick of the Roman mob trying to control the thing and the process, and the King of France essentially says, well, you vote as a bloc, do this, these are your orders, go in, do it, get out. And of course the most famous Frenchman, of course, who interferes with a conclave is Napoleon Bonaparte. There's the conclave that doesn't happen in Rome. The 1799-1800 conclave happens at the San Giorgio monastery in Venice, the one on the island that has the campanile that mirrors the one of San Marco. And they're locked up there for nearly, I think, 8 months between 1799 and 1800.
And the conclave that elected Pope Leo in 1507, 08, 1513. That took quite a long time.
Yes,
to produce a result.
Leo X, yes, one of the Medici popes, yes. And it did take a long time again because you have this politicking, you have family, clanic politics within the Roman. There's this sort of great opposition between. Obviously you have the Borgias who produce Pope Alexander VI. You have the Cardinal della Rovere, who becomes Julius II, the great kind of warrior pope, and then the Medici kind of working away in the background, who produce Leo X and Clement VII. So you essentially you in the early Renaissance period, you have this kind of election process that is entirely bound up in the political realities of Italy at that time, which of course, I mean, people think of the Renaissance as this kind of great flowering of culture. Italy is ravaged by war for most of the early 16th century.
I mean, it's been ravaged by disputes between the Crown of France and local Italian authorities.
Absolutely, and people change sides. I mean, the Republic of Venice is constantly kind of scheming, sort of great enemies of the Roman pontiff, constantly scheming to maintain their independence against the interference of the Church.
Which is why the Church of England, once it got going, was very interested in Venice.
Absolutely, indeed. It's fascinating.
Charles I, especially so.
Indeed.
They are Catholics, but rather like ourselves, we think of ourselves as Catholics, but not as Roman Catholics.
Exactly.
Was the view
Father
taken by
Sarpi,
lots of Anglicans.
Elizabeth I sends, it's one of the first places that allows Anglican worship to happen.
Yes.
The other one being, of course, the Golden Port, the Ottoman Sultan, who views the English as a fantastic ally against Spain in the Mediterranean. So you have this, as does Venice. So you have this funny thing that these two implacable enemies, namely the most serene Republic of Venice and the Ottoman Empire, are both courting England and actually courting Anglicanism. There's an amazing incident where actually under James I, the Dean of Windsor is the former Marco di Dominis, who is the former Archbishop of Split, which of course was Spoleto, was a Venetian possession, and he's a Croat in Venetian service who goes into a mighty falling out with the papacy and becomes an Anglican and becomes Dean of Windsor.
And the relationship with secular power becomes ruinous, really, during the papacy of Leo X.
Yes.
Because he is the Pope on whose watch the Reformation fire is lit.
Absolutely. And Leo is
and
known...
he carries some of the burdens of being a Renaissance Pope, doesn't he?
Yes.
I mean, he's very cultured. He's a great patron of the arts.
He's very urbane. He's witty. He's actually very well liked. The Romans like him. He's very sort of smooth. He's a smoothie.
He campaigned very, very hard during the Conclave to be elected Pope. And this rather terrible story used to be regarded as terrible Protestant propaganda, that he campaigned so hard. And the only people he saw during the Conclave, of course, were his brother cardinals.
Yes.
And as a result of unorthodox but hard campaigning, the new Pope acquired an anal fistula. Now, this was regarded for a very long time as Protestant, horrible, cheap Protestant lies.
Propaganda.
But I am told by people who've looked at the documents, though not perhaps at the remains of the Holy Father himself, that it is all true.
Yes, that wouldn't surprise me. I mean, he famously was purported to have said when he did finally win election, say, God has given us the papacy, now let us enjoy it. But he was left actually with legacies of his predecessor, Julius II, who is this warrior pope. He is constantly fighting wars with the other Italian powers, with the King of France, with the Spanish monarchy, with the Neapolitans, with the Venetians, with the Florentines. And he is also because he wants to see himself, he takes the name Julius for a reason. He's not echoing any of the saints. He's echoing Julius Caesar. He views himself as the Pontifex Maximus.
Well, this martial papacy of the late 15th century is actually a great success story.
It is. Oh, Julius II is an astonishing...
And after the terrible long years of the schism,
yes,
and the rise of conciliarism,
yes,
as a way of diminishing the unique authority of the papacy as a central
absolutely.
organ, from the mid-15th century onwards, conciliarism fades away, and the idea of a centralist church is reborn.
It is, and it's reborn
in the sense in which it really is a Renaissance period.
Absolutely, and the physical sense of St. Peter's as well. And this is partly what happens. Leo gets a bad rep, really, because actually what he's having to do is finally the bills are coming in for all the stuff that his predecessors...
And he's got to raise money by indulgence.
And the one mechanism, again, not unlike the Archbishop of Canterbury, people think that the Pope has all these levers he can pull. It's a little bit more complicated than that. Whilst his word might be infallible, the actual practical reality of getting things done gets clouded in a great deal of bureaucracy. The one lever he can pull, and pull again and again and again, is the lever of indulgences, and giving papal indulgences in particular, rather than localised indulgences, which everyone thinks, well, these are better. And he does that to, a considerable extent, partly to fund his predecessors' monumental designs for St. Peter's itself. That then, of course, filters down to the ground, and it's that really sends Martin Luther over the edge and sparks the Reformation. So in his kind of pursuit of beauty and his pursuit of kind of good management, he was elected in part, anal fistulas notwithstanding, in part because he was a Medici, and the thought was, well, this guy knows about money. He's a banker. Let's get him in because we are staring, the abyss.
Well, the modern Catholic Church might well be accused of having too many departments of state now.
Yes.
Dicasteries, as they're called.
Yes.
Run by very powerful individuals. And on the finance side, it's been really rather a disaster in terms of many of the investments. And the popes, the modern popes, have not really been that interested in
No.
the administration of finance. and
The
that
last
kind of
three
thing, have
popes, in particular,
well, they've loved their own sense of charisma. I think in the case of Francis.
yes. But he was not interested in the practical financial running.
No, but he loved the grand
Church.
gesture.
Yeah. Oh, yes. He did.
I mean, let's remember that he was brought up during the Great Age of Peronism.
Oh,
in
indeed.
Argentina. And if there's one thing that Peronism was all about, in the person of Evita herself, was the grand gesture,
Absolutely.
the identification with the poor.
Yes, that great sort of act of internal hypocrisy where
Yeah.
you talk about how humble you are by showing
That's
how
right.
humble you are, and you
Yeah.
get rid of the gold chair, but you make sure your wooden chair
Yes,
is
is-
on
is
top,
very visible.
is very visible, and everyone can see you sitting on the wooden chair, which struck a very different note to his predecessor, to Benedict XVI, who was almost the opposite of that, who actually was in favour of the kind of the long, discursive, the drawing on the traditions of the church, but he liked pretty things as well, fundamentally.
And lovely Prada red shoes.
And lovely Prada red shoes, and of course, gorgeous George, George Gansfien, his
Monsignor
archbishop.
Gisman, yeah.
Exactly.
He's now been exiled back to Germany.
Yes, I think so. I
Is
think
that one of the things that Francis did?
I thought
because he took him on as his private secretary.
He did,
as
yes.
well.
He did.
So he appointed, as it were, his first private secretary, who would just look after Francis.
Yes.
But he kept on.
He kept on.
Benedict's man.
He did.
And then he exiled him.
He did. But Francis, the legacy of Francis' management of is very real, and I think there is this kind of question about. There have been catastrophic misinvestments, corruption, and again, one of the things that probably sank Cardinal Parolin's campaign was that he was entirely complicit with this as the Cardinal Secretary of State, as effectively the Prime Minister of the Vatican. So that is probably the number one challenge, actually. Of course, there's the re-engagement of young people with religion, which we're seeing. Of course, there are the issues of peace around the world in the Middle East and in Ukraine and what the papacy can do about that. But actually, nitty-gritty wise, I suspect the first thing on Pope Leo's desk is probably
Is how to run things.
is how to run things and the money problem.
Well, how to run things takes us back to our own beloved Church of England.
Indeed.
And what should be done about all this.
Yes, because
And there's the perennial question of disestablishment, which is not going to happen because it's just too complicated.
it would involve
Unpicking that thread would be very bad.
the parliamentary time it would require would make Brexit look like a walk in the park.
Yes, it would.
It's too complicated, it's too interwoven, and it's why, interestingly, none of the parties seriously advocate for it because it's A, it's a fringe issue, and B, it would involve such complicated changes to the education system, to the relationship with the crown. It opens cans of worms.
It would be like going back to the late 19th century again.
Yes.
When there were great quarrels between the dissenting churches and the Church of England about this business of using state money in order to run schools, for example, and the whole nature of the authority of the church represented in Parliament. But reforming the Church of England in that respect would be a catastrophe.
Yes.
It'd make the whole thing look even more silly than it does now.
Yes. Agreed. I think the question is about the internal financial. The Church of England, actually, the Church of England's investment fund, what it runs as a kind of hedge fund, is in fact actually larger than the Vatican's equivalent.
Yes.
It's
well,
immense.
This brings us to the role of the Church Estates Commission,
Indeed,
doesn't it?
Indeed.
And they are the inheritors of the great reform, the great bequest given to the Church of England by Queen Anne.
Good Queen Anne, indeed, who tithes royal income, essentially, and says...
Because she saw that there was this great gap between the rich and poor among the clergy of the Church of England.
Well, she had a
That
kind
an
of...
awful lot of clergy were very well paid. But the great mass of the parochial clergy were not at all well paid.
Absolutely. And she saw this kind of... It was partly a political act, of course. I mean, Anne, I think, is a hugely underwritten and underrated monarch. I think, actually, she's exceptionally savvy in what she's doing politically here, because she sees these kind of Whig prelates who are the younger sons of great families who are sort of odious and corrupt and generally deists. I mean, they're not really practically Christians.
Well, she
many of them.
represented
Tory, and she saw precisely the parish clergy were in fact a Tory kind of bastion, and she wanted to do something for them. And you could accrue bishoprics and deaneries and make a very pretty living as this kind of Whig prelate. And actually, the man on the ground was struggling, and so she endowed this vast she tithed royal income. 10% of royal income is put into this fund.
And that was Queen Anne's bounty, and it was what paid the clergy.
Absolutely, and was specifically for the poorer parishes to make sure that you had some equity of income.
And it's that bounty, Queen Anne's bounty, that then at some stage in the middle of the 19th century or later on...
Robert Peel...
There's a new name for
Robert Peel does these reforms in the 1850s, just before he dies, mercifully. And he does it to the universities, and he begins... It's the kind of trollop, it's Hiram's Hospital, it's all that sort of stuff. There's this idea that the church is sitting on this money that ought to be done, and so it's put into the hands of commissioners. Actually, the more toxic reform is the one that happens in the 1970s, which is the introduction of a concept of common tenure, introduction of a concept of the beginning of the abolition of the freehold, and what is done then is to in the name of fairness to ensure the equitable payment of all clergy.
Now, the parson's freehold would used to be rather like a life fellowship.
Yes.
In an Oxford or Cambridge college.
Yes, exactly.
Once you were the parson, you had it for life.
You were the parson. And of course there are bad examples of that, good examples of that. But what essentially is done is that's beginning to be abolished in the 70s. And this money is essentially seized by probably the inheritors, the heirs to the very people Queen Anne didn't want it, the equivalent of the kind of Whig managerial bishops. Seize it, centralise it. And what they've been doing recently is essentially treating it like a hedge fund. So they're sitting on this money in order to invest. They say, oh, well, that gives us our income. But they give very targeted and politicised grants. So, if you are a big evangelical megachurch somewhere, well, you can get a grant very easily. But if you're a small, struggling parish church in a rural area, very difficult to get money out of the commissioners via the diocese. So we have this...
do you think the party spirit has infected the Church Estates Commissioners
absolutely.
themselves in their judgments?
Absolutely. I think we have a kind of... We are seeing again what plays out in the reign of Queen Anne. We essentially have a kind of Whig junto managerial caste.
City of London,
who precisely very rich. No coincidence.
Quite evangelical.
Yes,
in many cases.
Absolutely,
very powerful body of opinion.
Absolutely,
in the modern Church of England.
And view it as a kind of the previous Archbishop is on record of saying this, that he viewed it as a great department of state. It's like running the Home Office or like running the FCO. And it's viewed very much in those terms. And you then have a kind of...
pays for an awful lot of, as it were, CEO types or COO types.
Dioceses now have...
who are in charge of mission.
Cathedrals have directors of mission. They have... cathedrals now have CEOs and CFOs. Dioceses have diocesan secretaries who are now essentially CEOs. And that's where a lot of this, a lot of diocesan money is going on that. So therefore, there is a gap for the commissioners to fill, but they're not filling it. And the redistribution of that to parishes that cannot afford it. So ironically, you have what it sounds like a quite radically left-wing idea coming from the kind of the parish clergy in that Tory model that Queen Anne sets out.
Now, in the system as set up in the second quarter of the 19th century, or a little bit before, the Office of Church Estates Commissioners was invented. There's 1, 2, 3.
Three commissioners.
And they are answerable to Parliament.
The second Church Estates Commissioner is the voice of the Church of England in the House of Commons. And they are appointed by the governing party. And we have Marcia de Cordova, who is the MP, I think, for Vauxhall, Lambeth, somewhere like that, and she's a very devout churchwoman. But
they're on the payroll.
Yes, on the government payroll. It's a government post, and they are the Church Estates Commissioner. The problem is they are also very much governed by the ministerial, the managerial caste of the Church of England. Every session there are church commissioners' questions, and because a lot of MPs are vastly ignorant of this, the Church of England sends them suggested questions, and I've seen these. I've seen what they look like, and rather than asking
like party whips,
and it's essentially, isn't it wonderful what we're doing for the environment? Isn't the slavery reparations a wonderful idea? And it's just essentially parroting a party line, encouraging MPs to ask the Church Estates Commissioner, who gets her answers, frankly, from them anyway. And some MPs do break out of this, and there's been some very good questions recently by various MPs on both sides. I can think of two examples: Jonathan Davies from the Labour Party and Katie Lamb from the Conservative Party, both of whom have asked very astute questions about exactly what we've just been talking about what the church commissioners are doing with the money, which is what Parliament should be doing.
They do seem to operate rather like an oligarchic financial cabal.
Oh, it makes Gazprom look like, save the children.
So who can exert authority over them and get them to release more money and get it spent in rather wise.
Well, to go back to where we started, actually, this is the function of the state. And the people who can do this is by cutting through this and reappropriating the powers that are now in the hands of these endless committees back to the office of the Prime Minister. I think that's the only way you can cut through this, because realistically, you now have too many layers of quango, too much of this kind of. I'll use the word cancerous managerialism because it's because like a cancer, it kind of repeats itself, and it just
comes back over
and you create another. Each committee begets more committees. It's like there's Old Testament lists of Jehoshaphat begat, etc., etc. You have that with committees. I think the only way you can cut through that now is actually through essentially using Crown prerogative, and that's vested in the office of the Prime Minister.
And the Synod of the Church of England, its so-called Parliament, would not have any authority.
I mean, it's interesting. There have been some attempts.
There were some attempts back in the late 20th century.
There were, and
Frank Field,
yes,
Labour MP,
and a member of the General Synod,
was very, very critical in the investment policies of the Church and States Commission.
And there have been some motions brought recently. Interestingly, a motion brought where there was some dissent. Some of the bishops backed it.
Yes.
Bishops of poorer dioceses, Bishop of Blackburn, etc., actually backed a motion which called on, which was started in the House of Clergy. There's now sort of a bit of an insurgent movement with the kind of the Save the Parish campaign and various other things
which has been rather successful.
Which has been very successful. And actually, interestingly, this motion, with support from various, slightly unusual places, actually has passed. The problem is, of course, you can pass as many motions as you like. It's whether anyone actually goes and does anything about it. And I suspect what will happen is that will get lost in these committees. So therein lies the inherent problem of this.
And the appeal of the whole idea of church planting.
Yes.
Arises out of this very unhappy combination of influences.
Yes, and it's.
I mean, some voices in the church, possibly Church and States Commissioners themselves, rather like the idea of a gathered church, a gathered community.
Oh, yes.
And you go out and you plant a church,
yes,
or church without the definite article, which has become a very fashionable locution these days. So you plant a church in an upper room, as it were, or in a pub, or in a supermarket.
And you're pure and holier, and you're just attracting those. But of course, what you're doing is actually you are undermining the work of the parish.
You're undermining the notion of the geographical centre.
Well, and it's why I use, and I will use it again, the cancerous analogy, because of course what you're doing is replacing the cells that are there.
Yes.
Because this cell is trying to do its work, namely and these are the fundamental cells that make up the body of the Church of England. Its parishes. They are the basic unit of both ecclesiastical and civil governance for a reason. If you are undermining their work, replacing them with something different, then you are essentially kind of launching a takeover of that body politic, and it's not then surprising that cell dies, that the parish cell can't survive.
To know whether the administration of the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, in England and Wales and Scotland, is trying to do something similar with its own churches.
Yes, that I don't know. Of course, the thing that has affected, I know, the Roman Church in England catastrophically has been the withdrawal of the religious orders. Now, partly because England and Wales were viewed as missionary fields until the 1850s, certainly, and even in the 1850s onwards, up until the late 20th century.
Which is why Roman Catholics used to pray for the conversion of England.
Exactly, indeed. But a lot of this is because they... these parishes were then run by the missionary societies, by the fathers, or by Augustinians, or by Jesuits in many cases. Those orders have seen a catastrophic fall in vocations. The numbers of, I think, Roman Catholic male religious is globally, I think, is some mad number. I've got in my head 64,000, which globally, tiny, and not enough to even manage the parishes in England, let alone the parishes globally. So you have this problem that the orders have withdrawn from running these parishes, and there are not enough secular priests in a kind of ordinary diocesan structure to maintain them. So that's the issue, and you see it everywhere. I saw it very strongly in Liverpool when I was working there, but I even see it in the Cotswolds. Chipping Norton was previously always serviced, I think, by the priests who are at Heathrop, the kind of college there, or priests coming up from Oxford. Those orders have sort of withdrawn into themselves, so you're left with the secular priest who's now having to run multiple different parishes and doesn't have the time. So I suspect there's something slightly different, subtly different going on, but I don't know
it's
what
been
the
a great
is.
thing in the history of the Catholic Church, this divide, as it were, between the secular clergy and the religious clergy, the clergy who are members of orders. And in the period up until the Reformation, and perhaps for a while afterwards, the real intellectual life of the Church of the Catholic Church was in the orders among
Yes.
the Jesuits and the Dominicans.
Yes.
And the pre-Reformation secular clergy found it very difficult to keep up. They were not a learned clergy.
No, and there
And
was...
it was one of the great achievements, I think, of the Church of England, and the Protestant churches that then imitated the Church of England. The idea of a learned parochial clergy.
Yes, a learned man in every parish. That's the idea. Absolutely, and it's
And very true of the 18th century.
Well-
a century that has a very bad press in some of the more banal histories of the Church of
Yes.
England.
I think that is reversing
But I
now.
think there's a lot of revisionism.
But I there is a reason why there is, frankly, no kind of great piece of English literature that get from 1550 to probably 1950, maybe even later, that doesn't have some degree of an engagement with the Church of England. If that's Austen as a vicar's daughter, it's Lawrence Sterne, it's Jonathan Swift. There is this kind of, in the DNA of the intellectual life of the English nation is the Church of England.
The story thereby, the great influence of that very important demographic group, the sons and daughters of the clergy.
Indeed, some of our greatest minds. It's a marvellous Wikipedia article if ever you want to read the list of all the people. And Theresa May and Lammy, the rock musician, both in the same category. It's rather marvellous.
And Gordon Brown.
Gordon Brown, Theresa May.
Field Marshal Montgomery.
Indeed. Alfred Lord Tennyson.
Nelson.
And there's a glorious thing. When Nelson dies, of course, it all goes to his brother, who is he's a parish clergyman in Norfolk. And this sort of Spanish messenger arrives and says, your most serene highness, the Prince of Trafalgar, the Duke of Bronte. And it's just this sort of slightly dumpy clergyman in Norfolk who's suddenly all these amazing amazing titles because of what his elder brother had done.
Somebody once came to me and asked whether I thought a book should be written about the influence of the sons and daughters of the clergy in the life of Britain. And I think it is rather a good idea.
I think it is a good idea.
Because we are a rather distinctive group.
Yes, you wouldn't want them to know your secrets, though. Perhaps you want to.
No. And some are the victims of an overarching ambition.
Indeed,
well.
yes.
And very good at wanting to tell people what to do.
Absolutely.
And how to think.
Well,
how very fine to find that the Church of England and the Church of Rome have so many problems in common.
Indeed, and that's
been a very good canter around that particular ecclesiastical field today, Fergus. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And we're looking forward to our next subject already, aren't we?
Lovely to be with you. Thank you.